In other news, the proposed increase in value-added tax has sparked debate about priorities of the national budget, the stability of the government of national unity, and how South Africa can raise revenue to support its developmental goals. The Institute for Economic Justice says it's analysed the scrapped budget documents to understand how National Treasury was planning to resource strategic priorities, in the midterm development plan. Siyanda Baduza is with the Institute of Economic Justice and joins us now via our video link. Siyanda, thanks for your time and welcome to the SABC News channel. The big debate, at least as you and I speak, is around whether increasing VAT is the only way to raise that 60 billion rand that's needed for government to essentially cover its bases. And the ultimatum in some ways that seems to have been presented is that it's either we go ahead with some kind of tax increase or we do away with the social relief of the stress grants. But of course, the obvious question that comes out of that is there no third alternative?
I mean, I think, well, first of all, good morning, and thank you for having me. I think the first thing that I would push back against, I think, is the ultimatum that we have been given. I think that needs to be analysed as well, because it only came out this Sunday when the minister spoke to Sunday Times. And in it, he argued that if we let him scrap the SRD grant, then there wouldn't be a need for VAT. And I think that in and of itself is problematic, because what it's done is it's, well, of course, created this dichotomy where it's either the public has to accept an additional VAT increase or we scrap the SRD grant, which I think is definitely anti-poor, and I think it's definitely puts the blame of the VAT increase on poor people. And I think important context here is that the SRD grant isn't like unanticipated additional spending for National Treasury. So for one, even though it wasn't included in the medium-term budget statement in September last year, National Treasury's Director General, Duncan Peters, as well as Cabinet have confirmed, or did confirm last year, at least when we posed the questions, that there was allocation made for the SRD grant. And also, of course, we've had the SRD grant for the last 5 years. So it isn't like unanticipated, unexpected spending that's now being put as the reason for an additional VAT increase. It definitely isn't the reason. We would definitely need to see maybe additional financing if we were arguing for, if the government was planning on saying increasing the spending on the SRD grant, so increasing the value or the number of people who receive it. But in our analysis of the scrapped budget, we see that it's the exact budget line as it was last year. So I think we first have to definitely push back against that dichotomy.
Given your analysis that took place of the budget that would have been presented last month, where do you reckon we could trim the fat then, if it's not necessarily about going for a VAT increase to finance, for example, the SRD grant and many other social welfare programs, so to speak?
I mean, I think also our stance has been very clear that I think in principle, we support the government trying to find more resourcing. So I don't think we would argue that there has to be any fat trimmed, especially when it comes to social services, because that's the situation we've been in the last 10 years. There have been cuts to early childhood development spending, cuts to education, cuts to healthcare. And we know that those have had adverse impacts on a lot of the outcomes in those programs, which is why in this budget, National Treasury, while they weren't necessarily reversing a lot of those spending cuts, a lot of what the additional revenue that was proposed was to at least cut back the pattern that we've been seeing in the last couple of years. So, for example, this budget proposed an increased spending in early childhood development. There were increased spending in education, so increase in real spending per learner for the first time in a few years. Increases in education, above inflation increases even for social grants. So a lot of the programs themselves that would have received additional funding are things that we would support. We say if the alternative is either you cut spending or you increase taxation, then we would be for increasing taxation. However, the nuance is, of course, that that isn't the only way to do it. We've proposed a number of other alternatives that exist in order to raise the same revenue. So the principle is that, of course, I think it would be also a bad outcome if we if the VAT increase that was rejected, and instead of raising that 60 billion that VAT was projected to raise, we instead decided to cut further social spending, I think that would definitely be an adverse outcome as well. But there are alternatives which I can speak to.
I wonder if you can go ahead then, just briefly take us through them. I know there'd been questions around, for example, government reducing things like cabinet. I wonder how far that would go, taxing the wealthy, corporate tax, and increasing perhaps personal income tax. I'm not sure how many of those, for example, are featured on your list on alternatives.
Right. So I think the first one, I think the big one is definitely an implementation of some form of wealth taxation. So I think with us, there's recognition that this, of course, wouldn't be a frictionless process, and it would definitely take longer than how much time they have in order to table the new budget. But taxation in South Africa, I think by international standards, and a lot of academics agree on this, is heavily undertaxed. We tax quite a bit when it comes to personal income tax, for example, but in terms of wealth, that isn't an avenue that has been explored. And I think that is one that we definitely propose should be looked at in terms of raising additional revenue. Others that are maybe much more shorter term is one we've argued that there could be an increase in VAT, but only on luxury items. So we have good enough data to be able to map out the type of consumption goods that are spent on only by the wealthy. So at 25%, VAT on that could go some way in terms of raising some revenue here. Removing unnecessary tax breaks and subsidies that benefit the wealthy. So, for example, removing medical tax credits for people who earn a high enough income, so something like 800,000 rands a year, removing benefits from them in terms of retirement fund subsidies and medical aid tax credits. We can also raise corporate income tax, which we know was decreased a few years ago from 28% to 27%. That is also an avenue that could be explored. So there are a number of alternatives. I think the way that National Treasury has framed it has been that the only three options that are on the table is either a personal income tax increase or corporate income tax increase, and then those don't work, so VAT has to be the only other alternative. But there definitely are others that need to be spotlighted.
Yeah, I mean, part of the argument, for example, is that we can't really push corporate income tax any higher because it's already amongst the highest in the world, and there's concerns that it'll make our economy less competitive on the global stage. The reality, of course, is that even in instances where money is spent elsewhere, there are real concerns that it's not being spent efficiently. Yesterday, the SCOPA chair, that's Songezo Zibi, spoke of how, for example, there are leases that are signed on by government that are way above the market value. And one has to wonder whether or not we've done enough work to quantify the potential savings from just increasing efficiency before we look at slashing anything elsewhere.
Yeah, so we've done some work also in terms of looking at how much can be raised from just dealing with unnecessary and wasteful expenditure. I don't have the numbers now in front of me, but I'll try and look for them now as the interview goes on. But I mean, sure, that would definitely go some way in terms of raising revenue, but I don't think it would necessarily be enough to cover the 60 billion threshold, although it definitely would go a long way. So we also have to be looking at other alternatives that do exist, but definitely dealing with inefficiencies in government. It's also that the chair of SARS has also argued, for example, that if we were to increase the state's capacity in order to increase taxes, that would raise enough to not even require VAT increase. I don't know how accurate that claim is, but it definitely, like, investing in state capacity to collect more taxes is also definitely a solution. So I think maybe the important takeaway here is that we shouldn't just be looking at cutting spending, especially on areas where though that spending gives the realization of important constitutional rights, where there are definitely other areas that exist, like wasteful expenditure, like increasing state capacity to increase efficiency.
No, fair enough. Don't worry about those numbers. I'm sure we'll get another time to ventilate what they look like. But for now, let me thank you for the insights you have been able to share. Really do appreciate you helping us think through these sometimes complex issues. Siyanda Baduza is with the Institute for Economic Justice, joining us there as we continue our build up to the budget speech expected in just over 24 hours' time.